Good evening to everyone. I want to welcome you to this Bible study period. This would be the Bible study lesson for Wednesday, the 16th of December, our regular 6 p.m. Bible study on Wednesday evening. We apologize for those who would like to assemble in person. We're not able to do that right now. If you'll check our web page, there's an explanation for it on there, but basically we're trying to control some exposure to the COVID virus, and we are planning to have all our services in person canceled until the 27th of December. So bear with us, and we do appreciate it if you're tuning in for the recorded Bible lesson this evening. As you know, we're studying from a series entitled A Study of Prophecy and the Prophets. Brother Gene Taylor is the author, and we're actually on lesson 17 right now, just about to finish up with the study of the prophet Hosea. Hosea is one of the minor prophets. That doesn't mean he's less important than the others, but he is a prophet who has shorter and less voluminous letters. Some of the writings of the other prophets that we call the major prophets, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, many chapters, a lot to say. Hosea, only about 12 chapters, and some important things to say, but not as much as the others. So he is among those titled as the minor prophets. We've talked about Hosea himself in the past in other parts of our study, how his name means salvation or deliverance or God is salvation. And like the other prophets, he had a specific audience. Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom, we're told, and as such, he spoke to the people of the kingdom of Israel. Some of what he said, of course, was applicable to Judah and maybe even to us today, but that was his focus, the kingdom of Israel in the north. He was a prophet that was a contemporary of Amos, who we studied earlier. And as far as we know, he didn't have any other occupations. We know something about his personal life. He had a wife named Gomer, and she was a wife who had been a harlot. He was instructed by God to marry her. And then after she bore him 3 children, she went away into adultery again and became a harlot, seeking after many men. And this fits into the picture that God paints with Israel, his chosen people. God chose them as his bride, if you will, as his people. And they worshiped him accordingly, but they failed to keep his commandments. They went off into idolatry. And when that happened, that's like Hosea's wife, Gomer, leaving him to go into harlotry again herself. But God, through Hosea's writings, tells his people that he will indeed take them back, if they'll come back in a repentant way. And that's sort of like Gomer's wife. When God told him to go and take her back to him again, he went and bought her as a wife once more, and she became his wife again. And that shows how God would be the same way with his people. God's grief over their sins was real, and the date of the writing, of course, was right before the fall of the kingdom of Israel to the assault of Assyria. Assyria conquered them and took them all captive because, in fact, they did not repent and turn back to God. Talked about the setting, how that in Israel at the time of Hosea, their religion was pretty much false. It was idolatrous. The people were speaking lies against God. They were continually turning their back on him, and to the point where they had forgotten who God really was. We also find that morally they were corrupt. They had practiced fraud and deceit so long that it was just a common thing with them. And even though they attempted to be religious, they were still immoral and ungodly people. Politically, everything was in turmoil. Kings came and went very quickly. In fact, we noted that the preferred way of changing leadership in that age was assassination. Hosea prophesied in the reigns of these last 6 kings, and we did find an error there. I believe it's in the reign of let's see, where did we find that? Pekahiah, 2 years. I think it was Menahem, King Menahem. We said here he reigned 10 years, but I believe if we look up that scripture reference, it indicates that his reign was actually 20 years. So make that change in your course book, and we have to thank one of our students for pointing that out to us. Then we come along and we talk about not only the kings, but how the people affected, or how those kings affected the people themselves. We looked at a summary of the message that Hosea was presenting. His 3 children, Jezreel, Lo-Ruhamah, and Lo-Ami, were named after things that God was trying to get across to the people. Jezreel was, his name means punishment or destruction, and God would punish the dynasty of Jehu for the cruel treatment of Jezreel they had carried out. Lo-Ruhamah means no mercy, and God was prepared to show no mercy to his people in the Assyrian captivity if they would not turn back to him. Lo-Ami means no people, or not my people. And when God rejects Israel, it is as though they are not his people anymore. Now, we start looking at all this in the message, and we find that there's an overall message that the book of Hosea kind of presents this story of one-sided love and faithfulness that represents the relationship between Israel and God. God was always faithful to his people. He loved them no matter what. His people, however, did not do the same with God. Hosea's main purpose was to awaken the people out of their sinful condition, and mainly what the prophet writes about here is how that to gain favor with God once more, the people would have to repent and renew their subsistence upon God. So that brings us to the point 5 in our lesson book. If you'll take your book, if you have it, turn to page 66. We're looking here at the lessons we can learn from this book. If you don't have a course book, please go to our website and check under resources. You'll find a link there to the Wednesday evening material. You can download it as a PDF document and then keep it digitally, or you can copy it off, print it off as a physical copy. But that's where you can find the actual course book itself. And what we're projecting here on our screen are some of the pages from that course where we'll highlight the parts that we're talking about. The lessons really are kind of striking. One of them is simply this, that Hosea is writing about the downfall of a nation. Hosea's message about this is kind of interesting. What he says there is that inward corruption in a nation is more dangerous to its existence than its external enemies. So if you see the part we've highlighted here, yes, Israel had external enemies. There were still those tribes and people around them that would seek to destroy them, like the Assyrians and others. But the most serious threat to their existence was from the internal corruption that was present. I have a few verses here I'd like for us to look at that the scriptures seem to indicate this has always been the process, that you have to be careful as a nation about what your internal condition is like. In Proverbs 14 and verse 34, let's see if I can get to that slide. I was going to put it right here. Yeah. It tells us here, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Those are the words of the wise Solomon in the book of Proverbs. And we could even apply that to today if you wanted to look at our nation itself. And the way we'll be exalted or lifted up is because of the righteousness of our nation, not because of all the powerful things we can do to people around us. Sin in the core of our nation is a reproach, and it would be to any people. We also might refer to Jeremiah chapter 18. Here Jeremiah writes about the way in which the Lord believes that his people can be molded into that which he would like to have. And even as a nation, that if we are not the right kind of molded clay in God's hands, then the nation will be broken. It'll fall into pieces. Here's what he says: the word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause you to hear my words. Then I went down to the potter's house where he was, making something at the wheel. And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. So he made it again into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to make. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter? Look, says the Lord, look, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so you are in my hand, O house of Israel. The instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy it, if that nation against whom I have spoken turns from its evil, then I will relent of the disaster that I thought to bring upon it. And the instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to build and to plant it, if it does evil in my sight, so that it does not obey my voice, then I will relent concerning the good which I said I would benefit it. So God's using this example here of the potter who is able to take an imperfect pot and mold it again into one that is in his good measure. And he says, I can do that with kingdoms as well, but they have to be willing. They have to place themselves under the control of the potter and follow his will. And then in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, Paul writes this, For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. If you look carefully at this, Paul is writing here about all ungodliness among all men, every nation, every place where unrighteousness and ungodliness are practiced, then God is going to be the one who reckons with that, and his wrath will be revealed against it. So we understand there that for a nation to downfall and to be destroyed will most likely come from this internal enemy, this internal corruption. It brings it upon itself. In this section, Brother Taylor has listed for us the steps of Israel's downfall. I don't know that they're essentially in a correct order as far as one having taken place before the next one and so on, but these are some things that occurred during Israel's recent history which led to their downfall. And you can kind of see how each one builds on the next, perhaps, but let's take a look at these, and we'll be turning to the passages in our Bible that are indicated up here on the screen. The first one he mentions is a lack of knowledge. So we turn to Hosea chapter 4, and at verse 6, this passage we've read several times during the course of our study here. Hosea says, My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priest for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also will forget your children. All right, so what prefaces those remarks is this lack of knowledge. And we understand what had happened there. The people in Israel depended upon those who led them, the priests, the elders of the families, and those of the Levites who were in charge of worship at the temple. They were supposed to be the ones who were guiding the people of Israel, but their knowledge was faulty. They didn't have it. They didn't seek it. And therefore the people's knowledge was faulty. They didn't seek it either. They didn't seek to understand and read and learn God's law, the law of Moses, which was in effect then. So lack of knowledge causes them to do what? Causes them to reject God. When they have rejected him, then God rejects them. He says there in verse 6, Because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priest for me. So the people who were to actually be the priests, the ones who declared God to the people of the world, they weren't carrying out that responsibility. Lack of knowledge was a problem for them. And you notice that he also says here, I will also forget your children. Knowledge is transmitted from one generation to the next. And if God's people don't keep the knowledge of God alive and functional, then the children will not have it either. And the children then will be rejected or forgotten by God. Well, we can see that happening maybe in the world of religion today. Religious people should be dependent upon the knowledge that they get from the Bible. And a lack of knowledge because of a lack of study will result in people being forgotten by God because they have rejected Him. It doesn't even have to be just in matters of religion. Let's take our whole nation at one fell swoop here. A lack of knowledge about God among our whole nation can certainly lead to downfall because we have no standards, no way to keep in place those things that we need to practice and stand for as a nation. And we move to the second step there. Lack of knowledge could and probably does lead to immorality. If we're not aware of what the Word says and what God says, then we aren't likely to be able to apply His concepts to our behavior. And if we just make up our own rules as we go, then our morality is false. It's not standard-based morality. It's morality that is subjective. We just say, well, I think this is right, or this feels good to me, and so I'm going to practice it. Let's take a look at chapter 4 again. And in the first 2 verses, here's what the prophet writes. He's making the people listen as though they were listening to the Lord Himself. Excuse me. Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying, killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed. But you see, he even connects the two, knowledge and immorality, in these verses. He says there's no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land, and look at the result. They swear, they lie, they kill, they steal, they commit adultery. These immoral behaviors came about because of that lack of knowledge. So we can certainly see that relationship within the people of Israel for sure, and maybe in ourselves today. The country, the nation of America, has, I think, fallen into an acceptance and a practice of many immoral things. And it's not that the people don't understand what's right and wrong, but they have no basis for understanding it. It's an immorality brought about by lack of knowledge. Since we don't keep God's word active in our communities and in our cities and states and the nation as a whole, then there's no transmission of God's principles, and practicing immoral things becomes kind of a cultural norm. Everybody starts doing it. Everyone feels that it's okay. And that's sort of what Hosea continues with. If you stay in chapter 4 and look at verses 13 and 14, he describes these activities of the people. They offer sacrifices on the mountaintops and burn incense on the hills, under oaks, poplars, and terebinths, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters commit harlotry, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they commit adultery, nor your brides, harlotry rather, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots, and offer sacrifices with a ritual harlot. Therefore people who do not understand will be trampled. Notice what he says there. Being trampled is the result of this immoral behavior. And if you check out what he tells us there in verse 14, he says, therefore people who do not understand. Got to have that knowledge to understand what moral behavior is, and to not understand it like the Israelites were practicing, that's going to lead to being trampled, destruction in God's words. Looking down to the third point that he makes there, which is pride, you can also see how that might be in succession. If we have a lack of knowledge that leads to a practice of immorality among everyone in the country, or certain segments of it, then we can also start to see a certain amount of pride that has crept into the society. Pride is going to lead to something. It's going to lead to people stumbling. That's what happened in Israel. They stumbled because they were too proud to look at the words of God, and the prophets and follow their leadership. Also, they were going to be too proud to return to God. They'd be thinking, well, I do these things because I believe they're right. I believe they're the good thing to do. And I'm not going to change, and therefore I never will turn back to God because the desire to change is not there. Let's read from chapter 5 and verse 5. And Hosea writes this: the pride of Israel testifies to his face. Therefore Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them. That word stumble there could also be translated sin. The people sin because of their because of their pride. Sin itself is mentioned there in verse 5. They stumble in their iniquity, their shortfall, not meeting God's standards. When we talk about this pride, we need to remember too that it's a common thing that happens with people who are directing their own activities rather than relying on what God says. Many times the scriptures remind us of this. In the Proverbs, we read that it is not in man who walks to direct his own steps, or maybe that's from Jeremiah chapter 10, but the principle has been produced for us many times. Pride gets us into that position. We try to direct our own steps, and that's what the Israelites were doing here. If we take a look at the next one, insincerity, and I managed to not get that one underlined, but please notice it there at number 4. Insincerity, being insincere, it's a type of hypocrisy, isn't it? Not sticking with what we say we're going to do. Insincere, telling lies, not being sincere or truthful and straightforward with those to whom we have to deal. Let's take a look at chapter 6 again. And this time verse 4, he says, O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, and like the early dew it goes away. Therefore, and he goes on to tell what the results of that are. But what does he say in there? Not just to Israel. When he says Ephraim, that's kind of a code word for Israel. But also he mentions Judah. The people of Judah in the southern kingdom also had this problem. And this insincerity, you could kind of label that as faithlessness. Faithfulness has gone away. The faithlessness, insincerity, is what remains. And he gives these little illustrations of it. It's like a morning cloud, a cloud that appears in the morning like fog and then burns away, or like the early dew, when we see dew on the grass in the morning, but as it warms up, it goes away too. And so, you see that very quick vanishing of faithfulness. Insincerity could come from these other factors. If we don't have good knowledge and behave in an immoral way and have pride in our own thoughts and ways and not God's, then just look at what happens. Insincerity, faithlessness comes around. Faithfulness needs to come back in. And I think we can kind of apply that to the world we live in today as well. There is a lack of faithfulness towards God. People might acknowledge God and say, oh yes, I know there's a God, perhaps I believe in him, but it's insincere. There isn't any reliance upon that God whom they say they believe in or acknowledge as existing. Insincerity, the opposite of faithfulness. We don't see that faithfulness among people of the world today. And maybe that's what Brother Taylor was referring to when he gets to the next point, which is worldliness itself. Worldliness. Worldliness is being like the world, taking on the character of the people in the world, not necessarily the people all the time, but the precepts, the concepts of the world, putting a high price and value on material things, upon popularity and prestige and prominence and things like that. Worldliness. Let's see what he says about that. Chapter 7 and verse 8. Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. Let's go ahead and read verse 9 as well. Aliens have devoured his strength, but he does not know it. Yes, gray hairs are here and there on him, and yet he does not know it. Look at that. Worldliness comes from doing what? Mixing oneself among the people. Well, there's a principle that God tried to impress on his people way back, and that is, don't form alliances with the tribes and people around you. As you go into the promised land and conquer it. Run those people out or kill them. Do not let them stay, because if they do, you'll start to be friendly with them and you'll become like them. So the Israelites did that. They did intermarry with the people of the tribes around them, and they became like those people. Worldliness could affect us today. We live in the world. That's unavoidable. We are exposed to the things of the world, the concepts and the principles that people have, but we're not to partake of them. We're not to be worldly. And when we become worldly, then we become unheavenly. We become not like the spiritual person we should be, but we start to take on the character and the behavior of those who are of the world, those who are carnal, Paul calls them. Worldliness was a problem for these Israelites. They began to see things of the world as the highest in importance to them. Wealth, fame, position, social acceptance, and so on. And what does God say about that? He says in verse 9 that when these tribes have mixed with the people around them, verse 9 begins with this phrase here, aliens have devoured his strength. He's not talking about people from space here or from another planet either. He's talking about aliens, those who are not of Israel. What have they done? They have devoured his strength. Well, we can see how that would happen. God's people were to remain cohesive, firm, and separate as his people. When they begin to mix with people of the world, then the mixture is less strong than the pure substance, and that brings about failure. It brings about a loss of their strength. As we go a little further down to number 6 in this list, think about what's happening here. We've gone from a lack of knowledge through immorality and pride and insincerity and worldliness, and now we're getting to the point where people actually become corrupt. Their nature turns away from God. There's no desire inside to remain godly at all. Corruption takes over. Corruption I view sometimes like corrosiveness. If you leave the batteries in a device for a long time and they run out, what's left is corrosion. That acid leaches out of the battery and will eat up the electrodes and destroy the device altogether. Corruption is that sort of thing, which begins inwardly. Take a quick look at verse 9 of chapter 9. Here he says, they are deeply corrupted as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. He refers back here historically to the condition in Gibeah, where there was complete disregard for the principles of godly living. That section of Israel turned into a downright evil pit in the place. But here's his point. He says they are deeply corrupted. So if you know that the people of Israel have this deep corruption, then what's going to happen? Well, first of all, they're sinning. The corruption that is among them leads them to actually do sinful things. And what does God say about that? Verse 9 continues, he will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. So now Hosea starts to push this idea out about punishment. Not only are these things going to cause the nation to be downfallen, but there is corruption that's going to lead to punishment. And that punishment, of course, did come upon them when the Assyrians came and took the whole nation captive. Go a little farther to number 7 on this list, and we see something else that kind of fits into this progression. because of that internal corruption based on worldliness and pride and immorality and lack of knowledge. Now the people backslide. Backslide means just what it says, to slide back. Now with Israel, God had taken them out of captivity. Remember when he took them out of bondage in Egypt? He had taken them out of that servitude that they were in. When they backslide or slide back, they're going back into slavery again, but it's to sin. Sin has always been that which enslaves people. Even up in the New Testament, Romans chapter 6, Paul writes about how we are servants or slaves of whom we yield ourselves to obey. If we obey sin, then we become slaves, sins, to destruction. If we obey the righteousness of God, then we become God's slaves for righteousness. But you can see here that backsliding on the part of Israel put them back in that position of serving sin right where they came from. Take a look there at chapter 11 and verse 7. So here God says through Hosea again, "My people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt him." So this backsliding carries with it, the idea of calling on God, maybe beseeching that God will look after us, but then none will exalt him. We don't hold him in the exalted position in our lives that he should be, and so we have slid back. We've backslid into that position of serving sin. And notice there in that verse it says, "None exalt him." When people stop exalting God, then there is this inevitable backsliding back into serving sin, because you exalt sin when you serve it. We should exalt God. And in our country today, in our lives today, it's certainly important to remember this concept, that if we fail to exalt God in the proper way, as a nation, as people, as families, as, quote, churches, then we've done terrible wrong. We've not exalted God, and there will be backsliding. We'll slide back into the control of the world and of sin. The final thing that Brother Taylor lists on his list of the steps of Israel's downfall is number 8 there, which he titles idolatry. Now we know that throughout the history of Israel and also of Judah, there were times when the people would go from worshiping God to worshiping the idols and pagan gods of the countries around them. And whenever it occurs, it's a bad thing. God would sometimes bring direct punishment on his people for idolatrous worship. And then sometimes, like here with Israel, he reminds them that that's going to bring about their eventual destruction. Take a look here at chapter 13, and we'll read verses 2 and 3. Actually, let's start with verse 1. "When Ephraim spoke, trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. But when he offended through Baal worship, he died. Now they sin more and more, and have made for themselves molded images, idols of their silver according to their skill. All of it is the work of craftsmen. They say of them, 'Let the men who sacrifice kiss the calves.'" This is an interesting, little bit humorous way to put it. The craftsmen who make these idols and these false gods probably realize that they're nothing more than fashioned materials. And they kind of with tongue-in-cheek say, well, let the men who sacrifice to these false gods kiss them. We're not going to, but they will worship and make do with these gods, make love with them, kind of get very familiar and very cozy with them. Well, what's God telling us here? I think it's pretty clear that you can understand this if you go down to verse 3. Here's what we conclude with in this section. "Therefore they shall be like the morning cloud, and like the early dew that passes away, like chaff blown off from a threshing floor, and like smoke from a chimney." Do you see what he's talking about there? These people of Israel who had gone so far through all of these other steps and so on, so far as to be immersed in idolatry now. And again, this is not idols that have come in from outside. Look at that verse very carefully. According to their skill, he says, is where these idols came from. They've made for themselves molded images. And now they're immersed in idol worship from their own minds. And he says, what about them? They shall be like the morning cloud. Okay, we mentioned earlier in another verse, that's kind of like the dew of the morning, which burns away very quickly. Like the early dew on the grass that soon isn't there anymore. Like chaff blown off from a threshing floor. When they threshed the grain and collected the grain itself, the chaff was just the empty husks that blew away. They were wasted. They weren't seen anymore. And like smoke from a chimney. You can see around us now in the fall of the year, people begin to fire up their fireplaces. The smoke that rises from a chimney is there for just a little while, and then you don't see it anymore. It's gone. Well, we've covered some things here this evening that are important lessons for people to understand. Now, that last one there about the idolatry, I don't know how we can not see that happening in our society today. Things of our own fashioning, our own entertainment, our own prestigious people that are held up in positions of authority and charisma and all of that. We make idols today. And we're going to be like the chaff and the smoke and the morning dew. We will also pass away very quickly. Our existence will not be long if we go to that point. Our time's up for this evening, but next week we will consider, beginning with point B there, some of the other lessons that are apparent from Hosea's writing, and we'll go ahead and finish this book of Hosea next week. Also, we'll talk about the way in which Hosea's writings are expressed in the New Testament. You can find many references that are pulled directly from Hosea's writing and used in New Testament situations. We'll find that to be true as well. But we thank you for your attention. We are grateful that you were able to join us for this period of study. And please keep in mind those that are having difficulty with the coronavirus at this point, being exposed or not knowing if they're exposed and having to be quarantined and all that. It's frustrating and it's difficult. Please keep everyone in your prayers in that regard, and also those of our number that we know of who are having problems with health and other issues. We will continue to send out a weekly text message, kind of a newsletter, to bring everyone up to date on current events and so on. But for the purposes of us interacting with our lesson, if you have any questions or any ideas, any insights about the lesson that we've been working on, please post them in the YouTube comments section. That generates an email to me that says we have comments, and I can go in there and see what they are and make up the way to respond to them, either by direct email back to you or by bringing it up in the course that we're studying. So we'll start next week on page 66 at point B under the lessons to be learned. We thank you. We thank God for you being able to come and join us, and may God bless you, and we'll see you again soon.